Leo Tolstoy was a Russian writer who is regarded as one of the greatest authors of all time. Tolstoy was born at Yasnaya Polyana, a family estate 12 kilometers southwest of Tula, Russia, and 200 kilometers south of Moscow. He was the fourth of 5 children of Count Nikolai Ilyich Tolstoy, a veteran of the Patriotic War of 1812, and Countess Maria Dolostaya. His mother died when he was 2 and his father when he was 9. Tolstoy and his siblings were brought up by relatives. In 1844, he began studying law and Oriental languages at Kazan University, where teachers described him as both unable and unwilling to learn. Tolstoy left the university in the middle of his studies, returned to Yasnaya Polyana and then spent much time in Moscow, Tula, and St. Petersburg, leading a lax and leisurely lifestyle. He began writing during this period, including his first novel Childhood, a fictitious account of his own youth, which was published in 1852. In 1851, after running up heavy gambling debts, he went with his older brother to the Caucasus and joined the army. Tolstoy served as a young artillery officer during the Crimean War and was in Sevastopol during the 11-month-long siege of Sevastopol in 1854 to 1855, including the Battle of the Chernaya. During the war he was recognized for his courage and promoted to lieutenant. He was appalled by the number of deaths involved in warfare, and left the army after the end of the Crimean War. His experience in the army, and 2 trips around Europe in 1857 and 1860-61 converted Tolstoy from a dissolute and privileged society author to a non-violent and spiritual anarchist. Others who followed the same path were Alexander Herzen, Mikhail Bakunin, and Peter Kropotkin. During his 1857 visit, Tolstoy witnessed a public execution in Paris, a traumatic experience that marked the rest of his life. Tolstoy's concept of non-violence or ahimsa was bolstered when he read a German version of the Tirukkural. He later instilled the concept in Mahatma Gandhi through his A Letter to a Hindu when young Gandhi corresponded with him seeking his advice. His European trip in 1860 to 1861 shaped both his political and literary development when he met Victor Hugo. Tolstoy read Hugo's newly finished Les Miserables. The similar evocation of battle scenes in Hugo's novel and Tolstoy's War and Peace indicates this influence. Tolstoy's political philosophy was also influenced by a March 1861 visit to French anarchist Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, then living in exile under an assumed name in Brussels. Tolstoy reviewed Proudhon's forthcoming publication, War and Peace, and later used the title for his masterpiece. Fired by enthusiasm, Tolstoy returned to Yasnaya Polyana and founded 13 schools for the children of Russia's peasants, who had just been emancipated from serfdom in 1861. Tolstoy described the school's principles in his 1862 essay The School at Yasnaya Polyana. His educational experiments were short-lived, partly due to harassment by the Tsarist secret police. However, as a direct forerunner to A.S. Neil's Summerhill School, the school at Yasnaya Polyana can justifiably be claimed the first example of a coherent theory of democratic education. The death of his brother Nikolai in 1860 had an impact on Tolstoy, and led him to a desire to marry. On September 23, 1862, Tolstoy married Sofia Andreevna Bers, who was 16 years his junior and the daughter of a court physician. She was called Sonia, the Russian diminutive of Sofia, by her family and friends. They had 13 children, 8 of whom survived childhood. Their early married life was happy and allowed Tolstoy much freedom and the support system to compose War and Peace and Anna Karenina, with Sonia acting as his secretary, editor, and financial manager. Sonia was copying and handwriting his epic works time after time. Tolstoy would continue editing War and Peace and had to have clean final drafts to be delivered to the publisher. However, their later life together has been described by A. N. Wilson as one of the unhappiest in literary history. Tolstoy's relationship with his wife deteriorated as his beliefs became increasingly radical. This saw him seeking to reject his inherited and earned wealth, including the renunciation of the copyrights on his earlier works. Some of the members of the Tolstoy family left Russia in the aftermath of the 1905 Russian Revolution and the subsequent establishment of the Soviet Union, and many of Leo Tolstoy's relatives and descendants today live in Sweden, Germany, the United Kingdom, France and the United States. Tolstoy's son, Count Lev Lvovich Tolstoy, settled in Sweden and married a Swedish woman. Leo Tolstoy's last surviving grandchild, Countess Tatiana Tolstoy-Paus, died in 2007 at her Esta Manor in Sweden, which is owned by Tolstoy's descendants. Swedish jazz singer Victoria Tolstoy is also descended from Leo Tolstoy. One of his great-great-grandsons, Vladimir Tolstoy, is a director of the Yasnaya Polyana Museum since 1994 and an advisor to the President of Russia on cultural affairs since 2012. Ilya Tolstoy's great-grandson, Pyotr Tolstoy, is a well-known Russian journalist and TV presenter as well as a State Duma deputy since 2016. His cousin Fyodor Tolstoy, daughter of the acclaimed Soviet slavist Nikita Tolstoy, is also a Russian journalist, TV and radio host. Tolstoy is considered one of the giants of Russian literature. His works include the novels War and Peace and Anna Karenina and novellas such as Haji Murad and The Death of Ivan Ilyich. Tolstoy's earliest works, the autobiographical novels Childhood, Boyhood and Youth, tell of a rich landowner's son and his slow realization of the chasm between himself and his peasants. Though he later rejected them as sentimental, a great deal of Tolstoy's own life is revealed. They retain their relevance as accounts of the universal story of growing up. Tolstoy served as a second lieutenant in an artillery regiment during the Crimean War, recounted in his Sevastopol sketches. His experiences in battle helped stir his subsequent pacifism and gave him material for realistic depiction of the horrors of war in his later work. His fiction consistently attempts to convey realistically the Russian society in which he lived. The Cossacks describes the Cossack life and people through a story of a Russian aristocrat in love with a Cossack girl. Anna Karenina tells parallel stories of an adulterous woman trapped by the conventions and falsities of society and of a philosophical landowner, who works alongside the peasants in the fields and seeks to reform their lives. Tolstoy not only drew from his own life experiences but also created characters in his own image, such as Pierre Bezukhov and Prince Andrei in War and Peace, Levin and Anna Karenina and to some extent, Prince Nekhlyudov in Resurrection. War and Peace is generally thought to be one of the greatest novels ever written, remarkable for its dramatic breadth and unity. Its vast canvas includes 580 characters, many historical with others fictional. The story moves from family life to the headquarters of Napoleon, from the court of Alexander I of Russia to the battlefields of Austerlitz and Borodino. Tolstoy's original idea for the novel was to investigate the causes of the Decembrist revolt, to which it refers only in the last chapters, from which can be deduced that Andrei Bolkonsky's son will become one of the Decembrists. The novel explores Tolstoy's theory of history, and in particular the insignificance of individuals such as Napoleon and Alexander. Somewhat surprisingly, Tolstoy did not consider War and Peace to be a novel. This view becomes less surprising if one considers that Tolstoy was a novelist of the realist school who considered the novel to be a framework for the examination of social and political issues in 19th-century life. War and Peace therefore did not qualify. Tolstoy thought that Anna Karenina was his first true novel. After Anna Karenina, Tolstoy concentrated on Christian themes, and his later novels such as The Death of Ivan Ilyich and What Is to Be Done? Develop a radical anarcho-pacifist Christian philosophy which led to his excommunication from the Russian Orthodox Church in 1901. For all the praise showered on Anna Karenina and War and Peace, Tolstoy rejected the two works later in his life as something not as true of reality. In his novel Resurrection, Tolstoy attempts to expose the injustice of man-made laws and the hypocrisy of institutionalized church. Tolstoy also explores and explains the economic philosophy of Georgism, of which he had become a very strong advocate towards the end of his life. Tolstoy also tried himself in poetry with several soldier songs written during his military service and fairy tales in verse such as Volga Bogatyr and Oaf stylized as national folk songs. They were written between 1871 and 1874 for his Russian book for reading, a collection of short stories in 4 volumes published along with the new Azbuka textbook and addressed to schoolchildren. After reading Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, Tolstoy gradually became converted to the ascetic morality upheld in that work as the proper spiritual path for the upper classes. In Chapter 6 of A Confession, Tolstoy quoted the final paragraph of Schopenhauer's work. It explains how a complete denial of self causes only a relative nothingness which is not to be feared. Tolstoy was struck by the description of Christian, Buddhist, and Hindu ascetic renunciation as being the path to holiness. In 1884, Tolstoy wrote a book called What I Believe, in which he openly confessed his Christian beliefs. In his work The Kingdom of God is Within You, he explains that he considered mistaken the Church's doctrine because they had made a perversion of Christ's teachings. Tolstoy also received letters from American Quakers who introduced him to the nonviolence writings of Quaker Christians such as George Fox, William Penn, and Jonathan Diamond. Tolstoy believed being a Christian required him to be a pacifist. The apparently inevitable waging of war by governments is why he is considered a philosophical anarchist. Tolstoy believed that a true Christian could find lasting happiness by striving for inner perfection through following the great commandment of loving one's neighbor and God, rather than guidance from the church or state. Tolstoy had a profound influence on the development of Christian anarchist thought. The Tolstoyans were a small Christian anarchist group formed by Tolstoy's companion, Vladimir Chertkov, to spread Tolstoy's religious teachings. Tolstoy denounced the intervention by the Eight-Nation Alliance in the Boxer Rebellion in China, the Filipino-American War, and the Second Boer War. Tolstoy praised the Boxer Rebellion and harshly criticized the atrocities of the Russian, German, American, Japanese and other troops of the Eight-Nation Alliance. The Boxer Rebellion stirred Tolstoy's interest in Chinese philosophy. He was a famous cinephile, and read the works of Confucius and Lao Tzu. Tolstoy wrote Chinese wisdom and other texts about China. Tolstoy corresponded with the Chinese intellectual Gu Hongming and recommended that China remain an agrarian nation, and not reform like Japan. Tolstoy and Gu opposed the 100 Days Reform by Kang Youwei and believed that the reform movement was perilous. Tolstoy's ideology of nonviolence shaped the thought of the Chinese anarchist group Society for the Study of Socialism. In hundreds of essays over the last 20 years of his life, Tolstoy reiterated the anarchist critique of the state and recommended books by Kropotkin and Proudhon to his readers, while rejecting anarchism's espousal of violent revolutionary means. In 1908, Tolstoy wrote a letter to a Hindu outlining his belief in nonviolence as a means for India to gain independence from colonial rule. In 1909, Gandhi read a copy of the letter when he was becoming an activist in South Africa. He wrote to Tolstoy seeking proof that he was the author, which led to further correspondence. Tolstoy's The Kingdom of God is Within You also helped to convince Gandhi of nonviolent resistance, a debt Gandhi acknowledged in his autobiography, calling Tolstoy the greatest apostle of nonviolence that the present age has produced. Their correspondence lasted only a year, from October 1909 until Tolstoy's death in November 1910, but led Gandhi to give the name Tolstoy Colony to his second ashram in South Africa. Both men also believed in the merits of vegetarianism, the subject of several of Tolstoy's essays. Tolstoy also became a major supporter of the Esperanto movement. He was impressed by the pacifist beliefs of the Daukobers and brought their persecution to the attention of the international community, after they burned their weapons in peaceful protest in 1895. He aided the Daukobers to migrate to Canada. He also provided inspiration to the Mennonites, another religious group with anti-government and anti-war sentiments. In 1904, Tolstoy condemned the ensuing Russo-Japanese War and wrote to the Japanese Buddhist priests Soy and Shaku in a failed attempt to make a joint pacifist statement. Towards the end of his life, Tolstoy became occupied with the economic theory and social philosophy of Georgism. He incorporated it approvingly into works such as Resurrection, the book that was a major cause for his excommunication. He wrote a preface to George's journal Social Problems. Tolstoy and George both rejected private property and land. They also rejected a centrally planned socialist economy. Because Georgism requires an administration to collect land rent and spend it on infrastructure, some assume that this embrace moved Tolstoy away from his anarchist views. However, anarchist versions of Georgism have been proposed since then. Tolstoy's 1899 novel Resurrection explores his thoughts on Georgism and hints that Tolstoy had such a view. It suggests small communities with local governance to manage the collective land rents for common goods, while still heavily criticizing state institutions such as the justice system. Tolstoy died in 1910, aged 82. Just before his death, his health was a concern of his family, who cared for him daily. In his last days, he spoke and wrote about dying. Renouncing his aristocratic lifestyle, he left home one winter night. His secretive departure was an apparent attempt to escape from his wife's tirades. She spoke out against many of his teachings, and in recent years had grown envious of his attention to Tolstoyan disciples. Tolstoy died of pneumonia at Ostapovo railway station, after a day's train journey south. The station master took Tolstoy to his apartment, and his personal doctors arrived and gave him injections of morphine and camphor. The police tried to limit access to his funeral procession, but thousands of peasants lined the streets.